So once again, in the midst of this, we have another radical alternative, or another alternative from below that comes out of Latin America that really shakes up leaders in Washington, really scares them into changing their patterns of relations with Latin America. In the late 1940s in Guatemala, right, we're going to focus on Guatemala for a moment, which becomes really a case study and proving ground, both in terms of U.S. intervention, but also on the part of sort of Latin American alternatives to those interventions. But in the late 1940s, through popular election, there was the rise to the presidency of Jacobo Arbenz, who you see pictured in the center, who was a center left economic nationalist. We'll call him an economic nationalist. We'll get to him in a moment. He was definitely labeled as this, sort of radical communist and all of that. But in many ways, he was a radical economic nationalist. He was a former military man, and he believed that, and his administration believed that the profits from the vast wealth provided by the land, right, by Guatemala's produce, should go back to social programs, should go back to the development of Guatemala. That there should not be a relationship between the United States and their companies in Guatemala, which is simply extractivist. The idea that the land should belong to the people who work it, and the fruits of that labor should go back to those who work it. And Arbenz instituted a fairly moderate agrarian reform in which land was distributed to peasants, and a lot of that land had come from belonged previously to many of these American companies, in particular to the United Fruit Company. And this could not have terrified the business interests in the United States more, where you have small republics, these so-called banana republics, basically saying it is possible to nationalize the land and put the fruits of the land, put the revenue back towards social programs. He was labeled instantaneously in Washington as a communist, as a Soviet stooge. And Guatemala is fascinating in this era. By the early 1950s, it becomes both a great terror in the halls of power in Washington, but a great hope across Latin America. Latin Americans flocked to Guatemala in the early 1950s to witness this democratic experiment, this experiment with electoral democracy that doesn't necessarily lead to a corrupt officials, where the presidency is returning land to the peasants. But this was a really a breath of fresh air in the region, and like I said, people flocked from all over Latin America to witness it. For their part, the CIA initiates what is known as Operation PB Success, which is was a massive disinformation campaign on the part of the CIA towards the Guatemalan public, basically, creating stories that Arbenz was going to side with the Soviet Union, that Guatemalan children would be shipped off to the Soviet Union, all kinds of terrible things, were sort of projected onto this administration, none of which had any bearing in truth, really. And in the chaos that ensued, there was underground radio stations that the CIA set up, basically saying that Arbenz was being deposed, and it became like a very chaotic situation, particularly in 1954. And in the chaos that ensued, the United States trained and equipped a really small counter-revolutionary force led by the man you see to the right here, Carlos Castilla Almaz, who invaded the country from neighboring Honduras. And in the sort of power vacuum, in the misinformation and the chaos zone by this disinformation campaign, he quickly seized power in a military coup, and Arbenz was forced into exile. And this is extremely important because what you see here is, once again, a return to sort of a more violent form of U.S. intervention in Latin America, But this is the first case where we see the CIA, who would become such a big player in the years of the Cold War, right? This is the onset of the Cold War in Latin America. We see the CIA being used as sort of the shock troops for these interventions in Latin America rather than uniformed soldiers. And this event really sets in motion a long period of bloody dictatorship and eventually civil war in Guatemala that would last well into the last years of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. And so this really demonstrates a shift in U.S. foreign policy in the region to a more nefarious form of intervention. And for Latin Americans, people who looked to Guatemala as a great hope, as a beacon of what was possible through the democratic process. Young people in particular who were, all eyes were on Guatemala was possible. They saw, what could happen, right? If Latin Americans, through the democratic process, um, were not willing and prepared to defend their reforms at all costs, right? That it would end in blood. And this was a lesson that was not lost on many of the people who had flocked to Guatemala to witness it. In particular, two groups of people that were looking at it. One, very much Guatemala was in the minds of people like Fidel Castro, who you see pictured here, very young Fidel Castro during his days as a student. He very much was aware of what was going on in Guatemala, and shortly after initiating his own revolutionary struggle in Cuba, which we will talk about shortly, he very much was aware that Guatemala and Cuba became examples where revolution was necessary. No longer were we talking about reform. We were going to need to talk about revolution. One of the other, I think, most iconic figures was Che Guevara. Ernesto Guevara, who you see pictured right, once again, minus the beard and minus the beret. Ernesto Guevara was in Guatemala in this era. He was one of those folks who was not yet a committed, you know, proponent of armed revolutionary struggle. As a young man, he traveled to Guatemala to volunteer, to really observe this democratic process in action. And he learned a valuable lesson, or what he perceived as a valuable lesson, which was that you needed a revolution. This was not going to come, change was not going to come to Latin America through the ballot box. It was going to come through the barrel of the gun. And that revolutions needed not only to come to the barrel of the gun, they needed to be defended after coming to power. And so we're going to talk about this generation of young people who learned the lessons of Guatemala and implemented those lessons through revolution in a moment.